Good evening and welcome to the latest episode of The Boardmasters with me, Chris Mullins. And today I wanted to have another conversation with you around something that has been bugging me since I got into this space back in the summer, really. If you've seen any of my past footage, you will probably know that I got into board games having been a video gamer all my life. I absolutely love them. And it's really surprised me how few great, if any, great video game, board game adaptations there are. Now I will stress initially that I don't think the board game space necessarily needs a great board game that's adapted from a video game. It's not something that is necessarily required for the hobby to thrive, because it's in a golden age, as we know, and that's without a great video game one. But something you can see is that the demand is definitely there. I think Alex Radcliffe at Board Game Co did a great video recently on the top 10 highest funded Kickstarters of all time, and within that 2 of the top 10 were video games IPs, with another one in the top 20. So 3 of the highest funded board games of all time are video game adaptations. So there's obviously a market there, because although, yes, you can argue, certainly the Bloodborne one was made by Come On, so they're a huge company with a massive following. I think they had 5 or 6 in the top 20 outside of Bloodborne. But Steamforged Games made Dark Souls, and I think it was Mythic Games made Darkest Dungeon, and they were certainly the only entries those companies had in the top 20, and I think they are the highest funded games by those companies by a long, long way. And you would have to assume that is based on the IPs. And then Dark Souls came out, and I think based on the reviews and the scores on Board Game Geek, I think it's a 6.6. You have to say it's a disappointment. Bloodborne, although the board game with the miniatures isn't out yet, the card game isn't rated particularly well. There's God of War, the card game, which again isn't rated well. Street Fighter. There's a lot of big name video game IPs that have not transitioned across to the board game world well at all. Some have. I've got a couple here. I mean, XCOM is one of my favourite games that I own. I think it's fantastic. It does a great job of adapting the IP. I think it's a 7.6 on Board Game Geek, so it's well rated, but it's certainly not in the sort of upper echelons of the scores, and wouldn't consider it a great world-beating game, but it's certainly fun. Ni no Kuni is one that I bought because I am actually playing the game on PS4 now and really enjoying it. Got it in the Black Friday sales because it was under 20 quid, thought it was worth a punt. I believe that's a 7.1 on Board Game Geek, and I think those scores are sort of representative of most of the top video game adaptations, sort of games like Civilization. I think Fallout is in there. There is only one video game adaptation in the top 200 on Board Game Geek, I believe, and that's This War Is Mine, which is a game I really want to get hold of, but it's impossible to get stock at the moment. But even that was, I don't think it crept into the top 150, I may be wrong, feel free to correct me, I can't remember off the top of my head now. I think it was in the 150 to 200, and then a couple more in the 200 to 300. But there is such demand there for a great video game, and there are so many rich worlds that could be easily adapted into potentially a great board game. I mean, the one that annoyed me actually was Banner Saga, because that was a trilogy I was playing on the PS4 this summer. Phenomenal games, absolutely loved them, and discovered, obviously when I got into board games, either friends that knew I was getting into it were tagging me in posts on social media regarding board game adaptations, or I was just randomly typing those game names into Board Game Geek to see if there was an adaptation. And Banner Saga is such a perfect game. It's basically a board game already. It's a grid-based battle system with individual player powers and different enemy types and stats based. I mean, it's basically a dungeon crawler on the TV. But when they adapted it to a board game, they focused on the other side of the game where you're managing a caravan and its supplies and its morale, which is a fun bit of the game, don't get me wrong. It's where all the moral decisions are, and I can understand wanting to feature that aspect in a board game. But they pretty much ignored the combat. I mean, like a game recently that I backed on Kickstarter, Townfolk Tussle, that could basically be the combat section of Banner Saga. I haven't played Kingdom Death Monster, but it seems like that sort of game. Banner Saga would fit that perfectly with this amazing Norse lore with giants, and it would be phenomenal. I'd love to see someone get their hands on that and really make a great board game adaptation of it. But sadly we're not there yet. And I guess some people may say, well, where are the great video game adaptations or adaptations? I keep messing those up, so apologies for that. Where are the great video game adaptations of board games? And you know, that's a fair point. There aren't any direct, really board game to video games that are great. But I would argue that video games as a whole are like the offspring of board games. They are the natural progression of them. Every turn-based, stat-driven, role-playing game in a video game, every single one of those is inspired by board games. And Final Fantasy may not be based on a board game directly, but it's basically a board game that you play on your TV. So you can argue that pretty much every turn-based video game that's ever come out is inspired by board games. So I'm not sure that argument really tracks going that way round. I'm not aware of any great board games that may not be based specifically on a video game IP but are inspired by video games. Please comment down below if you're aware of any. But I don't think the advantages that video games bring over board games, i.e. like accessibility and managing all the less interesting mechanics in the background, like you're not having to roll the dice, the game just does it, for example. I don't think the other adaptations really translate back the other way. I mean, you could possibly argue that these big campaign-driven, narrative-driven board games that have started to become more prominent in the last decade potentially are inspired by, obviously, these big video games where you're spending 50 to 100 hours playing through. There may be something there. I'm going to be interested to get your thoughts on that down in the comments below. I mean, basically, XCOM, the board game, is based on a video game that, again, is basically just a board game. It's a turn-based strategy game where every action you take is basically decided by a hidden dice roll and all the tension that brings. And it's just a really interesting topic for me. Where are the great video game adaptations? I mean, there's a few I would like to see. I mean, looking at the Etherfields minis at the moment, there is one that looks like such a perfect mini of a Big Daddy from BioShock, and the lore and setting of that game is one of my favourite games on the 360. Probably would get in my top 20 games of all time. And the idea of Awakened Realms, who made Etherfields, expanding on that and making one of their narrative-driven, miniature-heavy games around BioShock is just an absolute dream for me. Or come on, as I said, they made the Bloodborne card game. They've reimagined that as a miniatures game, which is due out. Hopefully that, or Darkest Dungeon, which is the other highly funded Kickstarter video game adaptation. Hopefully they will be really highly rated when they come out. We don't know yet. But I would love to see come on, who I believe did the God of War card game. I may be completely wrong there, but I believe they did, and I would love to see them, if it was them, reproduce that as a miniatures game and adapt the mechanics and everything something more in line with what they've done with the Bloodborne games. Because God of War, again, phenomenal series. The update was amazing, and there's just such a rich lore that could be explored, and delving into that in a campaign driven board game would be really exciting for me, and I think based on the numbers that these high profile video game Kickstarters, it would make huge money it would be printing money for whoever ended up doing it, whether it is Come On or Awaken Realms or anyone else. But yeah, I'd just like to hear your thoughts, because I think it's an interesting discussion. I don't think board games need it. They will carry on going, but I just would love to see that really great high profile video, because again, this War of Mine is based on an indie game. It's not one most gamers will have even played. I played it because I got it free with PS Plus, and although I loved Frostpunk from them, and again that's another board game adaptation that I have backed and I'm really looking forward to, because that one does look like it could be that great video game board game based on the reception that it got in the campaign. There's the same video game maker made Frostpunk as this War of Mine, but I didn't get on with the video game of this War of Mine. It was very dark and miserable, and whilst I'm not always against that, it was just something I couldn't connect to, in the same way that I can't really connect with Fallout as a video game, for example, because it's just not a world I want to be in. I like to have some sort of hope and positivity going on. But that's going off on a tangent now. Anyway, as I've said a few times now, I would love to hear your thoughts down below. And if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and I will hope to see you soon. So thank you for listening, and have a good one. Bye bye now.